The first time the arc struck and the steel lit up blue-white in front of her, Eleanor Watkins thought she had made a terrible mistake. It was a damp morning on the Richmond waterfront, the sort of grey Bay Area winter day when fog clung low over the cranes and the slipways. Somewhere out on the river, a whistle blew, and the sound echoed between the half-finished hulls. On the keel blocks, just ahead of her, a Liberty ship rose like a cliff of steel, plates stacked and tacked into a shape that still looked more like scaffolding than like a vessel that would cross an ocean. Eleanor stood on a narrow staging platform bolted to the side of that hull, her leather gloves already slick with sweat inside despite the cold. Below her, sparks rained from a dozen other torches, bouncing off helmets and overalls before hissing out in puddles of standing water. A foreman barked something she could not hear over the din. The chalk line in front of her, the line she was supposed to follow, looked impossibly long. She had been a clerk in a department store in Oakland a year before. Now, in the winter of 1942, she was expected to weld the skin of a ship that might carry hundreds of men and thousands of tons of cargo through U-boat-infested seas. One bad seam, the instructors had told them, and a crack could run along a plate like a zipper being pulled, tearing the side of the ship open to the sea. "Helmet down, Watkins." The voice came from just behind her left shoulder. It belonged to a man everyone in the yard called Red, though his hair had long since gone to grey. He had welded bridges in the 1930s, boilers before that, and for the last 6 months he had been running a crew of new hires at Kaiser's Yard No. 2. Teenage boys, middle-aged housewives, a shoemaker, a piano teacher. People who, like Eleanor, had never expected to spend their days wrapped in asbestos jackets with an electrode in their hands. She snapped the helmet down, and the world narrowed to a slit of green glass. The noise dulled to a heavy roar. The puddled arc in front of her looked suddenly distant, like a miniature sun at the end of her hand. Red tapped the plate with a gloved finger. "Remember what I told you," he said, voice muffled now inside her ears. "You're not drawing a straight line, you're stitching, short runs, back steps. Think like a seamstress, not a painter." She thought of the bolts of cloth she used to measure out at Hinckley's department store on Broadway, of hemming her own skirt on a kitchen table, and for some reason that made more sense than anything in the orientation manuals. She squeezed the trigger. The arc flared, and the metal under her hand turned molten, a thin, glowing pool that she pushed along the chalk line for only a hand's width before stopping. Then, just as Red had drilled into them, again and again, she lifted and set the electrode a little way back along the joint, running another short bead that overlapped the first. To someone watching from the pier, it looked like she was stuttering, starting and stopping the weld every few inches. To Eleanor, feeling the tiny shifts of heat in the plate and the way the metal pulled as it cooled, it felt like learning a new kind of handwriting. By the time she reached the end of the seam, her shoulders ached and her fingers trembled. She flipped her helmet up and sucked in a breath of air. Below, a gang of fitters was already swinging another plate into position. 2 cranes moved in slow unison, lifting a prefabricated section the size of a house toward the ship like a child offering up a toy. Red leaned past her, inspecting the weld with the critical eye of someone who had seen too many bad ones. "Not pretty," he said, "but it will hold. And it will hold faster than the old ways ever did." He pointed with his chin toward the far slipway, where another Liberty hull sat nearly ready to launch. "You see that?" he said. "4 days from now. They want that ship in the water. 4 days. A year ago, we thought building one of these in 4 months was a miracle." He chuckled, more in disbelief than in amusement. "Get used to it, Watkins. Around here, the impossible just means next week." She tried to imagine that, a ship as tall as an office building sliding down the ways in only a few days' time, seams cooled and painted, holds already filled with crates and tanks and canned meat, bound for a convoy assembly point off the Golden Gate. She tried to imagine that scene repeated not just here, but up and down the coasts, in yards she had only ever seen in newspaper photographs: Portland, Baltimore, New Orleans, Mobile. The number the foreman had scrawled on the blackboard in the training shed came back to her. 2,700 Liberty ships in 4 years. At the time, it had sounded like something from a sermon, not from a construction schedule. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. The official name for the vessels rising all around her was EC2SC1, a string of letters and numbers that only engineers and bureaucrats loved. Sailors and longshoremen used a different word. They called them Liberty ships, after a statue in New York Harbor that most of the women in the Richmond yard had never seen in person. They knew the silhouette now almost as well as their own faces. The raised forecastle, the long, boxy midships deck, the engine casing and single tall funnel, the rounded stern. Before the war, building a cargo ship that size had been half art, half stubborn endurance. Plates were riveted, not welded. Each hull was a one-off, assembled in sequence from keel to mast, with specialist crews moving along it like a troop of traveling craftsmen. In the dockyards of Britain and Germany, that tradition went back generations. Men had followed fathers and grandfathers onto the ways. They knew each curve of each frame by feel. A ship was something bent slowly, like a story told over many evenings. What Henry Kaiser and his engineers did in the months after Pearl Harbor felt to many of those old craftsmen like a violation of that order. They cut the work into pieces. They carved the hull into hundreds of sections and handed each to a different crew, most of whom had never set foot on a ship before. They replaced the steady rattle of rivet guns with the flicker and hiss of electric welders. It was faster. It was cheaper. It was, in the eyes of traditional shipwrights, a kind of sacrilege. For the United States Navy and the British Merchant Marine, it was salvation. "Look there." Red touched Eleanor's elbow and pointed toward the open yard behind them. On the gravel lay a row of long steel plates, already marked with chalk. White lines crisscrossed them, in patterns that looked almost like dressmakers' patterns, blown up 100 times. "You see those marks?" he said. "Those are your doing." She frowned. I haven't welded those yet." "Not yet," he agreed. "But the way we weld them now, the way you weld them. That's why the planners can draw lines like that on a drafting table and know they will behave the same on every plate. That's what lets them cut these ships into blocks and still have them fit together." In the early days of the yard, back in the spring of 1941, when the first emergency program contracts had come through, the welders worked much as they had on bridges and boilers, long continuous beads, fighting against heat distortion with instinct and clamps and brute force. The result, when war hurry met imperfect technique, had sometimes been ugly. Plates warped like buckled floorboards, seams pulled just enough out of true that when a prefabricated block arrived at the slipway, it would not sit square against its neighbors. Fitters cursed and reached for hammers and torches. Hours were lost, opening up and re-welding joints that should have gone together like puzzle pieces. On one of those frustrating afternoons, so the story went, a slender ship's plate had cracked open under a long stress weld, the fissure running the length of the seam with a sharp metallic scream. The plate had to be scrapped. The schedule slipped. The man at the center of the scene had been Red himself, standing on a staging, much like the one where Eleanor now worked, his gloved hands spread helplessly as the newly welded joint split in slow motion. That night, humiliated and angry, he had gone home and sat at his kitchen table with a dull pencil and the back of an old blueprint. He drew plates and seams, arrows showing where heat would flow, where metal would contract as it cooled. He crossed out long runs and, almost without thinking, began to sketch short broken lines instead, overlapping like stitches in a piece of torn cloth. Backstep. Welding was not new. Engineering texts had described it for years, but in the rush to staff up the yards after Pearl Harbor, few of the newly minted instructors had the time or the habit of mind to re-engineer every procedure. They took what they knew from pressure vessels and construction work and tried to scale it up. Red, with his bridges and boilers behind him and a memory of plates cracking under his hands, had more reason than most to look for another way. He took his kitchen table sketches back to the yard. He persuaded a harried foreman to give him a single seam on a non-critical bulkhead and a few willing beginners. He had them run their beads in short, overlapping bursts, stepping back a little each time, the way a person might sew up a tier from the far end toward the starting point. He made them pause between segments, counting under their breath to let the heat wash out through the plate. When the inspectors came with their gauges and their hammers, the seam held. The plate did not warp. The edges stayed true. What mattered more was that the new method proved easy to teach. Instead of drilling anxious recruits on how to control a long, shimmering molten line, Red could tell them to focus on one hand width at a time. Strike, run, stop, step back, overlap, strike again. Within weeks, other crews were experimenting with the same pattern, adjusting travel speeds and segment lengths. In a yard of tens of thousands of people, good ideas did not remain secrets for long. For Eleanor and the other women in her cohort, backstep welding was simply the way things were done now, as natural as using a thimble with a needle. They did not know that somewhere in the office block, overlooking the yard, an engineer with a slide rule had taken the data from those early experiments and fed them into calculations no less exacting than the ballistic tables being worked out at the Naval Observatory. They did not see the charts showing how a particular sequence of short welds distributed stress along a seam, how it allowed plates to be cut narrower, brackets to be standardized, blocks to be transported by rail from inland fabrication shops without twisting out of shape. They just showed up for their shifts, collected their electrodes, and followed the chalk. The trick, as Eleanor's crew came to call it, was not a magic gesture or a secret wrist movement. It was a way of thinking about the work that allowed thousands of untrained hands to do in weeks what had once taken years of apprenticeship. The chalk mattered too. On a rainy day in early 1943, when Liberty ship output across the country was climbing toward an average of 1 every 3 days, a drafter named Sam Hollander arrived on the yard floor with a roll of paper and an apologetic expression. He had been working in the design office, where the big overall plans for the hull were inked on linen in sweeping arcs. But as sectioning grew more complex, he had realized that something was being lost in translation between those grand lines and the marks that welders like Eleanor followed. He unrolled his paper on a stack of plates near Red's work area. Instead of long, continuous curves, the drawing was broken into short-numbered segments, each the length of an average arm's comfortable reach. Little arrows showed the direction of each weld, like dance steps in a magazine illustration. "We can stencil these straight onto the plates," he said. "The fitters can spray through, you follow the numbers, and the heat will move the way the calculations say it should." Red watched as Eleanor traced one of the sequences with her finger. "It's like a pattern," she said. "Exactly," Hollander replied. "We used to trust that an expert could read a line and know how to work it. Now we have to assume the person holding the torch has been doing this for 3 days, so we write it out on the steel for them." Behind that simple admission lay the deepest change in American industry during the war. Shipbuilding, like aircraft production and tank assembly, was being reimagined from a craft to a process. The old masters, the shipwrights in flat caps, the locomotive fitters, the riveters, were still there, but they had been pushed up into roles that looked more and more like teaching and less like direct labor. Their knowledge had to be taken out of their hands and put into instructions that someone like Eleanor could follow on her first week. If the welder's impossible trick had a heart, it was this: the realization that you could compress years of tacit experience into a pattern on a plate, a sequence of short welds that not only held steel together, but held a schedule together as well. In the office of the United States Maritime Commission in Washington, the numbers flowed in, slowly at first, then in a torrent. Launch dates, tonnage delivered, ships lost to torpedoes and mines, ships laid down in response. Planners watched as Liberty hulls began to replace the outlines of freighters sunk in the North Atlantic. The early promise that America could build ships faster than Germany could sink them, started out as defiance and hardened into arithmetic. 2,710 Liberty ships by the end of the program, roughly 2,700 of them between late 1941 and 1945, each recorded in ledgers with dates and hull numbers and delivery ports. On the Richmond waterfront, those numbers arrived not as tables but as chalked announcements on the notice board. Record: New Liberty launched in 43 days. Then 35. Then, astonishingly, a single hull in just over 4 days, a stunt ship pushed through the system as proof of what was possible when everything aligned. Eleanor did not work on that famous hull. She was busy with a more ordinary one, whose name she barely registered as she stepped over its gangway. The night before launch, to check the last of her crew's seams. But she felt the shock ripple through the yard when the sirens wailed and volunteers lined the rails to watch the 4-day ship slide into the grey water of the bay. Later, at lunch, someone passed around a newspaper clipping with a photograph of the launch. Speeches from officials used the same word over and over: miracle. For the welders, it did not feel like a miracle. It felt like sore backs and singed cuffs, like learning to work with both hands so that you could alternate while one cooled and the other cramped. It felt like realizing that on a night shift in January, the air inside your helmet would freeze into frost while the metal under your hands glowed white. It felt, more than anything else, like repetition. Strike, run, stop, step back. Red had a habit of drawing little tally marks in chalk on the web of a frame before his crew started a long joint, ones for each short segment it would take to cross from one end to the other. Eleanor watched those marks dwindle as they progressed. The trick, she realized, was to think only about the next one. You didn't set out to build 2,700 ships. You set out to finish this seam on this plate, on this grey morning. With this arc humming under your hands, somewhere, many seams and many mornings later, a Liberty hull would appear under your feet almost by accident. In 1943, the yard brought in visiting delegations. British shipbuilders in dark suits, Soviet engineers in heavy wool coats, American congressmen in hats that did not suit hard hats. They walked along the catwalks, peered through goggles at welders at work, and asked questions that the guides answered in polished phrases. From overhead, the visitors saw patterns, prefabricated midship sections rolling in on rail cars from inland fabrication plants in Utah and Montana. Bow and stern units built under sheds, then trundled on dollies to the slipways. Hulls that had been nothing but ribs in the spring, now sitting high in the water in the fall, winches and booms already rigged. From inside a seam, Eleanor saw only the next few inches. One afternoon, after the visitors had left and the shift whistle had blown for the midday break, Red sat down on the edge of the staging and swung his boots idly in the air. "Do you know why all those big shots keep coming?" he asked. "To check the welds," someone suggested. "To check the numbers," Eleanor said, thinking of the endless talk in the newspapers about targets and quotas. Red shook his head. "They're trying to understand how we did it," he said. "They think there must be some secret machine, some hidden trick, but there isn't. The only trick is that we figured out how to let one person learn in a week what used to take a year." He tapped the plate again with his gloved knuckle. "And the funny thing is, that means every time you run one of these seams right, you're not just building a ship, you're proving them wrong. The ones in Tokyo and Berlin, who said democracies were too soft and too slow to fight a long war." The idea unsettled her. She had not come to the yard to prove anything to anyone in Tokyo. She had come because her brother had enlisted, and her father's small grocery could not support them all, because the poster in the post office had shown a woman with a bandana and a confident smile, and the words, "We can do it," in big letters. But as she lay in bed that night, listening to the faint, distant clang of the night shift, drifting across the bay. She turned Red's words over in her mind. The trick that was sending ships down the ways every few days did not belong to any single person. It lived in the fact that so many people had been allowed and pushed to learn so much so quickly. In the winter of 1944, a curious thing happened. Engineers at the Maritime Commission began to worry less about whether they could produce enough hulls and more about how those hulls were behaving in the North Atlantic. Reports came in of cracks in the decks and sides of some Liberty ships, long brittle fractures that had appeared in cold water after minor collisions or heavy seas. At least one hull had broken in two near Iceland, a sight that chilled every yard worker who saw the photographs pinned to the safety boards. The investigation that followed reached across continents and disciplines, from metallurgists in Midwestern steel mills to naval architects in Washington. It touched welders too. Some older hands seized on the news as proof that rivets had always been superior, that the rush to weld had been a mistake. Eleanor and her colleagues listened anxiously to the rumors. Had their seams betrayed the men who sailed over them? It turned out the truth was more complex. The steel used in some early Liberties was too brittle at low temperatures, especially where sharp corners and stress concentrations existed. Welding itself, when done properly, was not the culprit. But poor welding could make bad steel worse. In response, the same process that had produced the impossible output of the yards now turned inward. Procedures were revised, corners were rounded, crack arresters were added. Training films stressed not just speed, but contour and finish. Inspectors carried new gauges to measure bead profiles. Backstep sequences were adjusted to reduce residual stress around hatch combings and other vulnerable spots. On the Richmond staging, these changes arrived as new chalk patterns and slightly different rhythms, as extra time spent grinding and dressing weld toes. Eleanor found herself retraining her hands yet again. She did not know that, in the aggregate, these changes would help most Liberty ships survive not only wartime service, but decades of post-war merchant work. She only knew that her foreman now rejected seams that would have passed a year earlier, and that the schedule, astonishingly, did not slow. The trick, once learned, could be refined without being undone. By the time her fourth year in the yard came round, the war in Europe was in its final grinding phase, and talk in the canteen had shifted from production targets to rumors of peace and what life would look like afterward. Some of the women planned to leave, to return to homes and jobs that had waited. Others talked quietly about staying, of joining the small but real number who would go on to work in peacetime industry as welders, inspectors, supervisors. Eleanor was not sure which path she would take. The torch felt as natural in her hand now as a pen had once felt. The sight of a bare keel no longer filled her with awe. It looked like a beginning. One afternoon, she found Red in the shadow of a nearly finished hull, arms folded as he watched a new crew climb the staging. Teenagers, mostly. The war in Europe might be ending soon, but in the Pacific, the convoy lists were still long. "You know what they're calling us now?" he asked, without preamble. She shook her head. "Extension school," he said. "They say the whole yard is like a giant university where people learn one subject, and then suddenly the world is different because of it." He shrugged. "Maybe that's a fancy way of saying what we have been doing all along. You learn a trick, you pass it on, and then you watch what happens when a few 100,000 people all use it at once." She followed his gaze up the hull, along the sweep of plates and ribs and seams that climbed into the fog. Somewhere out beyond the Golden Gate, a line of Liberty ships was making its way across grey water, black funnels trailing smoke. Some were loaded with tanks and trucks, others with grain or coal or shells. Many bore the scars of near misses and bad weather. Plates slightly dented, fresh patches visible where welders in forward repair depots had done their own hurried work. Each one was, in some small way, a testament to the pattern that had been sketched on a kitchen table in Richmond and refined on 1,000 chalked plates. The admirals and ministers and field marshals who read intelligence reports in Berlin and Tokyo did not see any of that. They saw only totals: tonnage afloat, ships lost, ships launched. They shook their heads at the graphs, unable to reconcile the line of American output with their own models of what a society of free citizens, arguing and voting and striking and returning to work, could possibly accomplish. They did not see Eleanor on a wet morning in 1942 shifting her weight on a slippery staging and concentrating on the 6 inches of steel in front of her, unaware that the way she moved her hands would help push a nation toward a production level that pre-war naval planners would have dismissed as fantasy. They did not see the chalk marks wiped off by gloved sleeves, the small corrective taps of a chipping hammer, the way a crew leader would quietly swap positions in a line so that the one with the steadiest wrist would tackle the most critical join. In the ledgers, it all compressed into a neat figure, roughly 2,700 Liberty ships in 4 frantic years. On the staging, it remained what it had always been: arc, puddle, stitch, again and again until the hull closed and the yard whistle blew for launch. Eleanor never thought of herself as the inventor of anything. She thought of herself as someone who had been lucky enough to have a patient teacher at the start and a steady job when she needed it most. Years later, when interviewers and historians came looking for stories of the miracle of wartime production, they would try to get her to name the moment when she realized she was part of something extraordinary. She always went back, in her mind, to that first time the arc lit up and Red's voice sounded in her ear, telling her to think like a seamstress, to the way her fear of ruining a ship had shrunk when the work was broken into small, understandable pieces. What she did not say, because it seemed too grand, was that this was perhaps the most democratic of all the changes the war had wrought: the realization that you could trust ordinary people with pieces of an impossible task, and that if you gave them clear patterns and good tools and a reason to care about the outcome, they would not only meet your expectations, but redraw them. By the time the last Liberty hull slid down the ways in 1945, the impossible trick of compressing craft into process had spread far beyond shipyards. It was at work in aircraft plants in Seattle and Detroit, in tank factories in Ohio, in radar assembly lines in New England. It would not vanish when the victory parades ended. It would live on in peacetime industries, in the spread of welding itself as a standard technique, in the quiet confidence of women like Eleanor, who knew that, given a pattern and a purpose, they could learn almost anything. And somewhere, in an archive box, labeled with an anonymous hull number, there is a faded photograph of a Liberty ship leaving Richmond in a drizzle, confetti turning to paste on the wet deck, a slim figure in a dark helmet just visible on the catwalk above the waterline, a hand resting for a moment on a seam that had once been nothing more than chalk on cold steel. She was not a general, or an admiral, or a politician. She was a welder, one among thousands, but the way she stitched those short beads, day after day, helped make the numbers in the intelligence reports true. When the war was over and the totals were tallied, the convoys run, the cargoes delivered, the U-boats frustrated by ships that kept coming, some analyst somewhere must have circled the line that read Liberty ships completed approximately 2,700 and wondered, not for the first time, how such a figure had been possible if they had stood on that Richmond staging on a grey morning and watched Eleanor work. The answer might have been clearer. It was not a miracle. It was a trick of scale and learning, of thousands of people repeating the same careful motion until it remade the world's shipping lanes. And in the end, that might be the most remarkable thing about those 4 years. That history turned not on a single grand decision, but on the way a welder's hand moved 6 inches at a time along a line of chalk. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. If you would like, I can continue with the rest of the story, following this same tone and structure, to carry it through the later war years and into the post-war legacy of the Liberty fleet. The first time Eleanor saw a Liberty ship she had worked on leave the bay, she felt both pride and a strange, hollow unease. It was late in the summer of 1942. The fog had burned off by mid-morning, leaving the cranes and gantries etched sharply against a bright, washed-out sky. Yard number 2 had turned out enough hulls by then that launches were no longer singular ceremonies. They arrived like tides. Someone would tape a notice near the time clock, a hull number, a date, a rough hour. Still, whenever the schedule allowed, crews drifted toward the ways when the sirens blew, drawn as much by habit as by curiosity. From the crowded pier, the ship looked different than it had from the scaffolds and staging. Fresh paint blurred the seams. The flat sides and blunt bow that naval architects favored for cargo capacity now seemed almost graceful as they caught the reflections of the water. Children, brought in for the day by mothers who could not find anyone else to watch them, sat on their shoulders and pointed as the tugs began to nudge. A bottle shattered against the grey steel. The name, one of the endless succession of American towns, colleges, or historical figures that the Maritime Commission had chosen, rang out over the loudspeakers and was lost in the cheer that followed. As the hull slid into the channel, the shipyard band, squeezed awkwardly onto a temporary platform, struck up a patriotic march slightly out of tune. Confetti spiraled down and clung wetly to the deck rails. For a moment the ship seemed to hang, half in the water, half on land, and then it was floating free with only guidelines holding it. Eleanor felt Red shift his weight beside her. "Remember that seam we chased on the port midships plate?" he said quietly. "3 of us up there until midnight. I wonder if the inspector ever knew how close he came to failing it." She smiled in spite of herself. "He would have, when it cracked open under him, mid-Atlantic." Red's expression sobered. "That's the thing," he murmured. "We won't be there to fix it next time." The realization had been growing on all of them, that the work they did now would be tested far from any shop where a bad bead could be ground out and rerun. Their welds would see not just rain and tide, but winter storms in the North Atlantic, ice building on frames, shells bursting nearby. Men who had never heard their names would walk and sleep and curse over their seams. When the last confetti fluttered down and the ship's whistle sounded one tentative blast, Eleanor noticed that the crowd began to thin almost immediately. Someone had a shift to catch. Someone else had a boiler inspection. Production did not stop for ceremonies. She lingered a moment longer, watching the tug swing the new Liberty's bow toward the open bay. At that angle, with the funnel and deck houses foreshortened, the hull looked almost like a single slab of steel. It was easy to forget that what seemed like a solid wall was in fact a puzzle of plates, frames, and welds. Easy to forget that every few feet along its length, some stranger's hands had once hovered, trembling, over a small patch of liquid metal. In the months that followed, the ships began to come back, or at least their stories did. At first, the news travelled in rumours. A Liberty out of Baltimore that had limped into port with a torpedo hole patched by the crew in mid-ocean. Another that had been struck in a convoy off Iceland and vanished in a flash of fire when ammunition cooked off in the hold. Sometimes a superintendent would pin an official bulletin near the canteen, praising the yard's work on a hull that had survived a near miss. Sometimes photographs arrived, grainy images of familiar silhouettes taken in exotic harbours. One morning, a battered envelope appeared in the welding shack with a Navy postmark and a scrawl on the front. "To the crew who built hull 1729, Richmond." Inside was a short letter, written in an untidy hand on stationery headed "Somewhere in the North Atlantic." The writer did not give a full name, only a rate and a nickname. Boats, from the deck crew. He described a night in heavy seas when a depth-charge rack had torn loose in a storm and smashed into the rail. The deck plates had flexed alarmingly, but the hull, he wrote, had held like a rock. "Whoever ran those seams," the letter concluded, "tell them they gave us more than steel. They gave us a home we could trust when everything around us was trying to kill us." The foreman tacked the letter to the wall, and for weeks afterward, welders would pause to read it between shifts, their helmets pushed up and their faces streaked with soot. The letter did not mention the larger arithmetic behind those nightly ordeals. The tonnage of cargo delivered, the number of convoys completed, the dwindling tally of merchant losses as escorts, radar, and sheer hull numbers began to outpace the U-boats. At meetings in Washington and London, staff officers traced thick pencil lines across maps, showing where convoys had threaded through mid-ocean gaps, where sinkings had clustered. Before new tactics and technologies took effect, they plotted Liberty ships as tiny rectangles on those charts, moving them in their minds from American ports to British docks, to Soviet Murmansk, to the Middle Eastern oil terminals and back. For the people who lived inside those rectangles, the journey was less abstract. One of them, a young sailor from Kansas named Marcus Doyle, had grown up about as far from the sea as it was possible to be. His father had run a small hardware store in a town where the largest body of water was a stock pond. When war came, Marcus joined the Merchant Marine instead of the Navy, partly because a recruiter had told him truthfully that the pay was better. In the winter of 1943, he signed onto the Liberty ship that Eleanor had watched slide down the ways that previous summer. The name on his discharge papers would later be blurred by years of handling, but in his memory, it was as clear as the cold air the first time he stepped onto her deck in New York. He remembered the smell most vividly: paint, rope, oil, and the pervasive tang of steel. The cargo holds yawned deep and dark, newly fitted with dunnage and cargo battens. The winches on deck were so clean that they seemed almost fragile. The welds along the handrails and deckhouses, which a casual eye might have missed, struck him as strange at first. He had expected to see rivet heads, like the ones on the few pre-war freighters he had glimpsed in magazines. Instead, there were smooth seams, slightly raised, running like veins along every joint. The old boatswain, assigned to break him in as an ordinary seaman, had spat dismissively over the side when Marcus asked about them. "Welded, not riveted," he said. "Newfangled business. They say it's faster. We'll see if she holds together off Greenland." She did. Through black-walled seas and bitter wind, past icebergs that glowed ghostly at night, the Liberty ploughed on. The crew learned the peculiar groans and shudders of her hull, the way she seemed to flex and spring back as waves struck her bow. Down in the engine room, oil-streaked men coaxed steady revolutions from the triple expansion steam engine that had been old-fashioned even before the war. On deck, Marcus learned to trust the firmness under his feet, even when the sky and sea both vanished into driving snow. He trusted the men around him too, but he always suspected that without the hidden work of strangers in a yard he had never seen, no amount of courage would have kept the ship afloat. In a cramped mess one night, huddled over watery coffee, a radio operator waved a crumpled newspaper clipping. "Says here," he said, tapping the print with a grease-stained finger, "they're putting a new Liberty in the water every few days now. 1 yard did 1 in 4 days. 4 days. We must be made of paper?" A gunner shook his head. "I don't care if it took them 4 hours," he muttered, "as long as it gets us there and back." From the vantage point of the convoy, Commodore on an escorting destroyer, the individual welds and seams were invisible. All he saw was a long column of grey hulls stretching from horizon to horizon, each carrying so many tons of food, fuel, trucks, and ammunition that planners had begun to measure their work not only in ships but in calories delivered, shells fired, miles of road and rail laid down in Europe and Asia. Back in Richmond, those abstractions never appeared on the notice board. What did appear one day in early 1944 was a different kind of message, a printed excerpt from an Allied shipping report noting that U-boat sinkings of merchant vessels had dropped sharply over the previous 6 months, even as Allied tonnage at sea had risen. At the bottom, someone in the office had underlined a simple sentence in pencil: "The ability to replace losses with new construction faster than they can be inflicted has turned the tide in the Atlantic." Below that, in a different hand, probably a foreman's, someone had added, "That means you." The shift in tone was subtle but real. The first frantic year after Pearl Harbor had been dominated by panicked questions. How fast can we rebuild? How many hulls can we lay down? How soon? By 1944, the questions had changed. The yards had proven that they could hit targets that would have sounded like propaganda a few years earlier. The impossible had been normalized. Now, the challenge was to maintain that tempo while refining quality and responding to lessons from the fronts, changes in anti-aircraft armament, improvements in convoy procedures, repairs to the few places where Liberty hulls had shown weaknesses in cold seas. For welders like Eleanor, that evolution appeared as a steady tightening of standards. Inspectors who might once have waved through a slightly undercut bead now rejected it without comment. Training films showed magnified cross-sections of welds and metallurgical diagrams. Chalk patterns were updated with new backstep sequences around high-stress areas. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The pressure to keep up was intense, but it came from more than just production quotas. By then, nearly everyone in the yard knew someone overseas or someone who had not come back. Names of sons and brothers, cousins and neighbors appeared on casualty lists tacked up in the same spaces as the schedule sheets. Some women had begun to wear small gold stars on chains around their necks. When a Liberty ship went down, the loss was not just a number in a column. It was an empty chair at a kitchen table, a letter that never arrived. There were frustrations too. Rumors circulated that some ship owners and charterers were careless with their valuable hulls, overloading them, sending them to ports with inadequate tugs, failing to make timely repairs to minor damage. Newspapers ran the occasional story about a captain who had run aground through negligence, or a port authority that had let a vital vessel sit idle for weeks because of bureaucratic tangles. On the staging, such stories sparked bitter jokes. "We knock ourselves out to get them off the ways," one welder grumbled as he chipped slag from a seam. And then someone in a suit ties them to a pier with red tape. Red, overhearing, said nothing for a long time. Then he spoke without turning around. "Once a ship leaves here," he said, "she belongs to everyone else. The Navy, the Merchant Marine, the dockers, the convoy officers. We can't control what they do. We can only make sure that if they treat her right, she'll be there when they need her." He paused, ran a finger along the still hot metal, and nodded. "And if they treat her wrong, at least she'll have a fighting chance." That sentiment echoed in its own plain way. The debates occurring at higher levels in Washington, economists and industrial planners were already beginning to look ahead to what would happen when the war ended. 2,700 Liberty ships represented a staggering amount of tonnage. They had been built as emergency measures, with an expected service life measured in years, not decades. Yet, many of them now seemed likely to last far longer. What would peacetime do with so many hulls? Some argued that a surplus of cheap cargo ships would flood the market, sinking freight rates and ruining private ship owners. Others saw in the Liberty fleet the foundation for a post-war boom in world trade, a chance to move food, raw materials, and manufactured goods on a scale never before imagined. The arguments were abstract then. On the staging, the welders' concerns remained stubbornly immediate. In the spring of 1944, a new welder joined Eleanor's crew. His name was Frank, and he wore his age and his experience like scars. He had been a riveter in a yard on the East Coast before the war and had come west after a layoff. On his first day, he watched silently as Eleanor demonstrated the standard backstep technique on a training plate. "You really do it like that on hull work?" he asked when she flipped her helmet up. "Yes," she said, suddenly unsure. "That's the pattern," he grunted. "We would have been fired for stitching like that in my old yard," he muttered. "Why?" she asked. "Rivets spread the stress," he said. "A bad weld traps it. Crack runs like the devil, if you're not careful." He wasn't wrong, as far as it went. Poor welding could indeed create brittle zones, especially if the steel chemistry was off or the cooling was too rapid in cold air. But when Red took Frank aside and showed him the procedures that had been developed and refined over the last 2 years, The preheating in extreme cold, the rounded corners on openings, the extra crack stoppers, the older man's skepticism eased. "I never thought I'd say this," he admitted one evening, watching a Liberty hull in the dry dock behind the shop. "But you might just have found a way to do with welding what we could never do with rivets, build this fast and still sleep at night." He pointed to a forward bulkhead where patterns of short diagonal beads ran like herringbone, stitching around a large hatch. "In my day, only the best men would have been allowed near a plate like that," he said. "Now you've got girls 20 years old doing it straight from a few weeks' school." "And it holds." Eleanor caught the grudging respect in his voice and felt a glow of vindication, not so much for herself as for the method they all used. Yet the method's true test lay not in shop talk, but in the merciless environment of war. In November of that year, a Liberty ship out of another West Coast yard took a torpedo in the Mediterranean. The blast tore a ragged hole in her side and buckled internal frames. The crew fought fires and flooding for hours. In the end, they had to beach her to keep her from sinking outright. Photographs taken later, as salvage teams worked around the twisted metal, showed something curious. The major cracks had stopped where the designers had placed arrestor plates, pieces of steel intended to interrupt the path of a tear. The welders' short beads in those zones looked intact. Naval architects pored over those images and quietly revised some of their earlier doubts. The combination of process, pattern, and material, imperfect and improvised, though it had been in the rush of 1942, had, on balance, worked. By then, the Liberty program was nearing its peak. Yards up and down the coasts and along riverbanks inland were hitting their stride. At the same time, newer, more specialized ships, faster sea types, tankers, troop transports, were entering service, beneficiaries of the lessons learned on the crude, boxy Liberties. For some in the Maritime Commission, the Liberty fleet had always been meant as a stopgap, a bridge to a more elegant post-war merchant marine. For the men and women who worked on them, they were something else, the proof that a democracy, given a clear and urgent goal, could compress a generation's worth of industrial change into a handful of years. The war, of course, did not pause to admire that achievement. In the Pacific, where distances were longer and islands more scattered, Liberty ships carried everything from aviation fuel in 5-gallon cans to prefabricated airstrips and hospital tents. Many had their decks modified to carry landing craft or to mount extra anti-aircraft guns against kamikaze attacks near the end of the war. They moored off blood-soaked beaches with names that would become part of a grim litany: Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima. Some went down under enemy fire, others were battered by typhoons that no one had had time to model in test. Tanks. When a Liberty was lost, the report eventually filtered back to the yard in a terse notice: sunk by enemy action, total constructive loss after grounding, missing, presumed lost. For every such entry, there were far more that simply read, "in service." In 1945, as the fighting in Europe drew to a close and the fury in the Pacific approached its climax, those words took on a new shade of meaning. In service no longer referred only to war. It began to hint at a future beyond it. It was in that ambiguous season, with victory close enough to taste, but not yet certain, that Eleanor received another letter, this one addressed to her personally. It came from Marcus, the Kansas sailor, though she did not know him by name until she opened it. A mutual acquaintance, a cousin who worked in the yard office and had taken to connecting names from crew lists with names from the welding rosters, had passed her address along through official channels. Strictly speaking, such personal exchanges were discouraged. Letters took time and censors' attention, but in practice, the web of war found its own ways to tighten. The letter was long and meandering, written over several days on whatever paper Marcus could find aboard ship. He described not so much battles. Those, he knew, would be cut by the censors, as the textures of life on a Liberty. "How do I put it?" he wrote. "You made us a sort of moving town. The plates creak when she rolls, but after a while you learn each voice. There is a spot on the port side, just forward of number 3 hold, where the welds are as smooth as anything I have ever seen. We lean against the bulkhead there when the watch is quiet. It feels like leaning against the side of a barn at home, only there is an ocean on the other side." He went on to talk about the war in terms that the posters and newsreels never used. "We see the big ships sometimes," he wrote. "The carriers and the cruisers with their flags and their bands and their sharp lines. They get their pictures in the papers. But there would be no point to them without us. What good is a fleet that cannot eat, cannot shoot, cannot move men and fuel? You folks back home built the bones and the blood. The admirals only move the hands." Eleanor read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a tin box at the back of her single dresser drawer. She did not show it around the way the foreman had displayed the earlier general note. It felt too personal, too raw. Yet in the weeks that followed, as rumors of Germany's collapse solidified into newsreel images of surrender, she found herself thinking of Marcus's phrase, "a moving town." It was a homely metaphor, but it captured something essential about what the Liberty ships had become. They were not, in the end, just steel and steam. They were communities in motion, crews from all over the country, cargoes that would feed or fuel other communities overseas, a chain of effort stretching from ore mines and blast furnaces through yards and factories to distant ports and frontline depots. In that chain, her impossible trick was only one link. Without the miners, there was no steel. Without the chemists, no electrodes. Without the railroad crews, no plates delivered on time. Without the dockers, no cargo loaded. But without a way to let ordinary people turn raw steel into reliable hulls at a rate that defied pre-war imagination, the chain would have broken at the water's edge. When victory finally came, first in Europe, then after the awful revelations of the atomic bombings in the Pacific, the yard erupted in celebration and uncertainty in equal measure. Whistles blew, flags appeared on cranes, someone strung bunting along the catwalk between two slipways. A hastily assembled loudspeaker blared speeches from Washington. Toasts were made in coffee and the occasional contraband bottle. Then, almost immediately, rumors of layoffs spread. The emergency had driven the hiring. The emergency's end would inevitably bring contraction. Some contracts would be cancelled outright. Others would be completed and not renewed. The talk in the canteen shifted from deadlines to discharge dates. Eleanor watched as notices went up, which crews would be kept to finish existing hulls, which would be let go first. Preference, the management said, would be given to men with families to support and to those whose skills were hardest to replace. There were meetings and petitions. Some women who had postponed decisions about their futures while the war lasted now faced them head-on. Did they return to previous roles, to homes that had changed in their absence, to expectations that took no account of the welds they had run and the ships they had helped launch? She thought of the seams that had once terrified her, of the letter in the tin box, of the slow accumulation of confidence over 4 hard years. In the end, the choice was made as much by the economy as by individual will. The yard did reduce its workforce. Many of the emergency crews dispersed. Some went back to clerking and teaching. Some went into new post-war industries, construction, automotive plants, the nascent fields that would later be called aerospace and electronics. A small core remained, tasked with repair work and with the occasional peacetime ship order. Welding as a trade did not vanish. It had, in fact, been irreversibly changed by what had happened between Pearl Harbor and the war's end. Eleanor was among those who stayed on, at least for a while. The pace slowed. Launches were no longer weekly, let alone daily. There was more time to look at the work, to think about what it meant. One day, several years after VJ Day, a journalist visited the yard to write a retrospective piece about the Liberty ship miracle. The journalist was young, with crisp clothes and notebook pages already half-filled, with quotes from managers and engineers. He asked Eleanor to describe the trick that had made it all possible. "You must have had some special way of working," he said, pen poised. Some secret technique. She hesitated, then shook her head. The closest thing to a trick, she said slowly, was realizing that if you want to do something that big, you have to make each small piece understandable to someone who never thought they'd be able to do it. He frowned, as if hoping for something more dramatic. So you're saying it was all just planning? He pressed. Planning, she agreed, and trust. They trusted us with the work. We trusted the people who drew the patterns and checked the metal, and the men at sea trusted ships welded by hands that had been pouring coffee in diners a year earlier. That's not a secret. It's just a lot of people taking each other seriously, the journalist scribbled, though it was not clear how much of her answer he would use. He seemed more interested in the single statistic he repeated back to her before he left. 2,700 Liberty ships in roughly 4 years. Even for her, hearing the number phrased so boldly still produced a small shock. She thought of Marcus's description of a moving town, of Red's kitchen table sketches, of Sam Hollander's chalk stencils, of Frank's grudging respect. She thought of the plates that had cracked and been redesigned, the lives lost on ships that had gone down despite all their efforts, the far greater number of lives saved because enough steel had been persuaded into the right shapes at the right times. Later, walking home past the now quiet slipways, she paused at a spot where, years earlier, she had watched confetti fall on a new hull. Grass had begun to creep up through cracks in the concrete, where once only mud and water had been visible. The cranes stood idle silhouettes against calmer sky. Somewhere far away, Liberty ships were still sailing. A few had already been sold to private companies and repainted with new names. Others were being laid up in reserve fleets along quiet riverbanks, ranks of grey hulls moored bow to stern like a forest of steel trunks. A few had been scrapped, their metal sent back into furnaces to become girders or automobiles, or perhaps the frames of the new peacetime ships that would replace them. The welds she had run would outlast her. Even if no one ever traced them back to her hands, they would carry in their own mute way the memory of what could be done when an entire society decided together that the impossible ought to be treated as a challenge rather than a verdict. Years later still, when she was an old woman and grandchildren asked, more out of politeness than real curiosity, what she had done in the war, she would sometimes take out the tin box and show them Marcus's letter. She would not talk much about battles or about leaders. She would talk instead about the first time she lowered her helmet and struck an arc, about the terror and the exhilaration of seeing steel melt and reform under her hands, about the chorus of hisses and sparks that had filled the yard at night like some industrial hymn. If they pressed her about the scale, about the oft-quoted figure of 2,700 Liberty ships in 4 years, she would say only this: we did not set out to build that many ships. We set out to learn how to run one seam the right way, and then another and another. By the time we looked up, the numbers had taken care of themselves. And perhaps that, more than any statistic or speech, was the quiet lesson of those frantic years, that when millions of ordinary people master their own small, impossible tricks and fit them together, the result can be something that future field marshals and industrialists, staring at their trembling reports, will find as hard to believe as any miracle. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.